So we're up to Daf Pei Zayin on the top. We're halfway through the Mishnah, and we're talking about Yayin Linesachim and which Yayin should we use? How do we get the best wine for the Nesachim? Which wine should we exclude? And the Mishnah excludes here Hakmochim. This is literally translated as white flour, but it means that the Mishnah uses that term to describe the that part of the sediments that rise to the surface of the wine, velo mishuleha, and the sediments also sink to the bottom of the barrel, and therefore you should not be using the wine from the bottom of the barrel, mipnei hashmarim, elamevi mishlisha. So instead of from the top of the barrel, where you have these particles, that white particles that look like flour that rise to the top, and not from the bottom of the barrel where you have the sediments, but rather from the middle of the barrel. And even within the middle section of the barrel, you could divide up that section into three. So it's the middle of the middle. And now the Gizbar, who's in charge of supervising that we have the right wine for the Nisachim, Ketzadu Bodek, how should he determine and evaluate whether the wine is pure? So Hagizbar Yoshev Vakana Biyado, he's going to motion with this reed that's in his hand, kind of like a stick. That's what the Gizbar is going to do. The Gemara is going to talk about the fact that the measuring stick in the hands of the Gizbar, which let's say normally he might use to, for different purposes, but anyway, he carried it with him. And Zorak Hagir, the gear is these particles that we discussed before that um, are generated by the sediments of the wine, and instead of saying something to the person out loud and notifying him that all this froth from the barrel, has to be removed, and what he would do is he would hikish bekana. He would take this reed, the stick in his hand, and he'd tap the spigot, and that would indicate that the worker should now close the spigot, shut off the flow. And the Gemara is going to discuss why he wouldn't say this to him verbally, but rather he tapped on the spigot. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, sheyesh bo kmochim posel. Not only should he avoid using wine that has this accumulation of particles that rise to the surface of the barrel, but if he does use so, then it's invalid, it's posel. It's disqualified. The entire barrel is disqualified if it contains these particles on the top. The Tanakhama said that one should not take the wine from the top of the barrel, so he wants to avoid these particles. But Rabbi Yossi went a step further and he said that it's invalid. Shenemar tmimim yehu lachem umin chasam. And the word tmimim here means unblemished, without any mum. Tmimim yulachem v'niskehem. And the pasuk says, as far as the Nesachim is concerned, they have to be tmimim, without any blemish, and therefore the wine for Nesachim may not be blemished in any way. And if there are moldy particles, that's considered a blemish, and the wine is invalid. The Gemara says the following: Ein mevim lo masuk Right, the Gemara is actually quoting the Mishnah, lo masuk, v'lo mavusha, v'lo ma'ushan. These are wines that are excluded because they are sweet wines or cooked wines or smoked wines and heavy possible. V'hak tani reisha. So why did the Mishnah contradict itself when earlier in the Mishnah it says ein meviim es hali stayim, which are kind of very sweet wines, v'im heavy kosher, but if he brought it, it's valid. And here you're telling me that im heavy posel, Amar Avina kroch utni, which is a kind of methodological principle that applies very often when you want to combine two rulings. So, for example, you had a ruling about li storin, and combine that with the sweet wines, and both wines are possible. Rav Ashi Omer has a different way of reconciling this contradiction in the Mishnah by saying that chulya de shimsha lo mois, but chulya de pira mois. So what caused the sweetness of the wine? If it's because of the fruit, like the grapes that were used to produce the wine, that's called mois. Mois means it's repulsive, and therefore it's possible. But if the sweetness is a result of the sun and its impact on the grapes, that's not repulsive, that's not mois, and therefore heliostion is valid. B'diavad. Ein mevin yashon divrei Rebbe v'chacham machshir. We have a machlokas recorded in the Mishnah about old wine, which means wine that's more than a year old. Omar Chizkiah, my time of the Rebbe, why does Rebbe exclude wine from a year ago? Omar Kro la keves yain. We have a kind of an equation in the pasuk between the keves, which is for the Korban Pesach, and yain. What is this equation teaching us? Ma keves ben shnaso, just like the keves has to be in its first year, but not beyond its first year. Af yain ben shnaso. So Gemara says, if you're going to equate yain with keves, then ima keves ben shtei shanim posel. Af yain ben shtei shanim posel. You should go a step further and say that if, just like in the case of a lamb in its second year, meaning after it's 2 years old, it's invalid, it's possible. And therefore wine in the second year should be possible. So v'chitei machinami, maybe a nachinami. Just like we said that yain after the first year is possible, maybe if it's 2-year-old wine, it should also be possible. Vatanya, but we have a brayso that says yain ben shtei shanim lo yaviv him hevi kosher. Now, it seems that from the fact that this brayso is excluding old wine, at least lechatchila, only imhevi b'diavad it's kosher, would be Rebbe Shita. Man Shamet Le, who is the author of this brayso, the Omar Lo Yavi, that if it's older wine, you don't bring it on the mizbech. It's Rebbe. Uka Omar, nevertheless, Rebbe is quoted here as saying Ben Shtei Shanim imhevi kosher. So you see that Ben Shtei Shanim is kosher, and yet if Rebbe excludes yain after the first year because of the equation to keves, he should have excluded it in the case of Shtei Shanim, and therefore we have to find a different source for Rebbe. Ela Amar Rava Hainu time of the Rebbe. What's the reasoning for Rebbe? The Chsiv Altera Yain Kiyis Adem. And this is a pasuk in Mishlei, a warning to those who would want to avoid sin. They should not partake of wine when it is most red, because then it's very intoxicating, very delicious. Anyway, we see that wine is considered choice wine when it is at the height of its ruby hue. and that lasts up to a year. So after that year, its colors begin to fade. The Torah requires lechatchila that the libation wine for nesachim should be mivcha, should be choice wine, and therefore Rebbe says that if it's more than 1 year old, it's not choice wine because, as we said before, the um, the ruby hue begins to fade. The color begins to fade. This touches on the whole issue about white wine for Kiddush and for Nisuch Hayayin. Anyway, so now based on the uh, alternative explanation of Rebbe's source offered here by Rava from the Pasuk in Mishlei, then we begin to understand why Rebbe says Ein Mevin Yashan. So it's not going to be based on the equation to Keves, because that would have led us to the conclusion that the Yayin should be possible after Shtei Shanim, and we know from the Brisa that Yayin ben Shtei Shanim lo Yovim Hevi Kosher, but rather we're talking about the fading of the wine, which means it's not, the choicest wine, and therefore that's only Lechatchila and Im Hevi Kosher. Then the Mishnah says, Ein Mevin lo min adolios. Right, so we had a little bit trouble here with the translation here, but anyway, there's some sort of vines that are suspended in midair on trellises. But if you have vines that trail on the floor and they absorb the nutrients from the ground, that's kosher. Tana, we have a brisa that says kromim ha'avudim. When do we have the choicest wine? That's in the case of vineyards that are dug up pamayim b'shana, twice yearly. And that's the best kind of cultivation of the vineyard. Rav Yosef Havalei Karna de Pardisa, he owned a corner plot of a vineyard, de Rafik Beit Fe Rivka, and he would dig twice in the year. V'avad Chamra de Dori Maya al Chad Train. The land would produce wine that sustained a dilution of 2 parts water for every 1 part. And that's unusual because in the old times, when wine was thick and had to be diluted, 3 parts of water would be added to 1 part of wine. But in the case of Rav Yosef's wine, it was so strong that it was diluted with 6 parts of water for every 1 pint of wine. So it was doubly strong, right? Instead of 3 parts of water, 6 parts of water in order to dilute it and make it drinkable. Right? They didn't want to use large casks because then the sediments would rise up to that area, but rather they did it in small barrels. And Tanu, we learned in the Brisa, chavios, kadios, ludios. That's a certain kind of a barrel, which is a small barrel, ubeninis, and they're equivalent to the medium-sized Ludian jugs. Okay, that you have to know more about the Ludian jugs. Anyway, so we don't do them 2 by 2, side by side, because the wine in one barrel might spoil, and the other wine in the next barrel will absorb its fumes and also spoil. So therefore, we don't put them one next to the other, side by side. Ketzad Bodek, how does the Gizbar check out the wine and make sure that it's clear of impurities? Gizbar Yoshev V'Kana Biyado, Zorak Hagir Hikish V'Kana, and all this we saw in the Mishnah. So the Gemara elaborates with a brisa, Zorak Hagir Shel Shmorim. When the barrel apparently discharged all this froth of sediments is Gizbar Hikish Bekana. The Gizbar tapped with his reed onto the spigot to signal that the spigot should be shut. Don't add any more wine because now the wine is ready. Why doesn't he just tell the worker, shut off the flow? Why do you have to strike the spigot with a reed? So speech is not a good thing for wine. So therefore the Gizbar would use his stick rather than speech, because speech is not good for the wine. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that wine that has that mold that we spoke about from, from the particles is possible, even b'diavad. Boy, Rabbi Yochanan had a doubt about it. He kedisho. We saw this over and over again. We said that there's a separate violation of a lav if you're magdish a balmum. And what if you were magdish this moldy wine, according to Rabbi Yossi, which is considered blemished? Maushi yilkalav mishum balmum. Should we say keva de pasul kibal dum dami? O dilma ein balmul behema teku. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. Elim mi Moav. The rams for sacrifices were bought from Moav. Kvasim were bought in Hebron. Agolim, the calves, from Sharon. Gozos mi Haramelech. Of Yehuda Omer, Meviim Kvasim Shegavhan Kirachvan. Very fat lambs. They're as fat as their height. Very wide from fat. Omar Rabba Bar of Shiloh, my time of Yehuda Dechsiv, he derived from a pasuk. And just one second. The pasuk is in Yeshayahu. What does it say in the pasuk? Yireh, which means to graze, miknecha your livestock, bayomahu kar nirchav, very broad lamb. Siv. Since we quoted Rav Shiloh, we quote another drasha of Rav Bar Shiloh. Ksiv al chamusayich Yushalayim ifkadati shomrim. Also a pasuk in Yeshaya. Upon your walls, Yerushalayim, I have posted guardians. Kol hayom kol layla tamid lo yechashu. They're not silent. Hamazkirin Hashem al dami lachem. What does that mean? Who remind Hashem not to be silent. My Amri. What were those Shomrim saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? It says they'll never be silent. Hachi Amarava Barav Shilo, Atat Takum. Again, a pasuk in Tehillim, Tirachem Tzion. Please have mercy on Zion. The guardians are angels that plead before God for Israel's redemption, and they petition all the day or all the night. Redemption could come at any moment. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Amar Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem. Again, a pasuk in Tehillim, and it's written in the present tense. Ki bachar Hashem b'Tzion iva l'moshav lo. Hashem has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling. Permanent dwelling in the world to come, according to the Marsha. Okay, now we begin the 10th parak. Shtei midos shel yovesh hay b'migdash. They were measuring tools for dry measures, and there were two of them. Isaron v'chatzi isaron. One was an isaron and one was a chatzi isaron. And this is the view of the Tanakama of our Mishnah. And this is how they measured flour. Reb Meir Omer, however, Isaron, Isaron, v'chatzi Isaron. There were three categories of kalim used to measure the flour for menachos. There was the Isaron, and the chatzi Isaron. So now the Mishnah explains. Isaron, what was the function of this measuring thing that had an Isaron? That was the flour for all the menachos. And the menachos require an Isaron of flour. Lo haya moded, he would not measure lo b'shlosha lepar. As you might have thought that for a par, which is a sacrifice of a bull, you need three isarons. You have to create a measuring vessel that's three isar. No. What you would do is you would use the one for an isaron three times over. Velo b'shel shnaim li'ayil, and ayil requires two isaron. Elamodedim isronos, right? We measure the flour of the menachos with single isaron measurements, and once, twice, and thrice. Now the Mishnah says that there was another midah called a chatzi isaron. Ma'aya mishash. What was its function? Shebo yemoded chavite kohen gadol. Right, the chavitin of the kohen gadol that were brought daily, half in the morning and half in the evening. So he would measure the flour for the minchas chavitim of the kohen gadol, mechza b'boker mechza bein harbayim, meaning the isaron would split half for the morning, half for the evening, and therefore he needed a measuring of a chatzi isaron for the measuring of the flour of the Kohen Gadol's chavita. Gemara says the following. Tanya, we learned to the Brayso Reb Meir Omer, Matav Lomar. What do derive from the Pasuk? Isaron, Isor Lakeves HaEchad. Right, the Pasuk in Bamidbar Perek Chav Ches, which is repeated several times in Perek Chav Ches and Perek Chav Tes. And these are the descriptions of the Niskei Menachos and Esachim Menachos that are brought in conjunction with the various karbanos of the Moadim. So that's the parsha of Moadim. And there appears to be some indication from the Gemara that the Brisa here means to excerpt this phrase from a verse Dafka in Perek Tes. But be that as it may, Malame Sheshtei Esronos Hoy b'Mikdash. There were two measuring utensils in the Mikdash, and Echad Gadush, v'Echad Machuk. One was overflowing, and one was completely leveled, was flat. Gadush, the one that was overflowing, was heaped Bo Hayamoded L'Kol HaMenachos, and in order to measure an isaron for the menachos, he would use an isaron gadush. Gadush sort of means like it's in the air, so to speak, meaning it goes above the rim of the utensil.